A factory worker in an American mill town around 1905 could go an entire working life without ever seeing fresh milk that wasn't diluted with water and colored back to a false richness with chalk, without ever eating bread that hadn't been bulked out with alum or plaster to stretch a baker's flour supply, and without ever once sitting down to a meal that resembled what we now call a proper dinner. This was not rare deprivation. It was the baseline. And the question worth asking is not whether workers survived on this. Clearly they did, by the millions. But what exact combination of bread, salt pork, saloon food, and sheer physiological endurance made 14-hour shifts possible on what modern nutrition science would call a failing diet? This is a story about America first, because the industrial food economy that developed in cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh built its own distinct culture around hunger, immigration, and the strange commercial workarounds that filled the gap wages left behind. It stretches from tenement kitchens to saloon counters to oyster carts on street corners, through the specific hardships of textile mills and meatpacking plants, and only briefly crosses the Atlantic to show how European industrial cities solved the identical caloric problem with their own local ingredients. Start with the lunch pail itself, because the object barely existed yet in the form most people picture. Workers carried food, wrapped in wax paper, tucked into repurposed biscuit tins, or held loose in a cloth bundle, since the metal lunch pail familiar from later decades had not yet become standard factory equipment. What went inside depended almost entirely on where a worker's family had emigrated from, and that detail turns the story away from a single flat narrative of poverty into something more specific and more human. A series of engineering solutions disguised as cultural habit. Swedish immigrant workers in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis frequently carried pickled herring, a food that traveled well without refrigeration and delivered a dense hit of protein and fat that lasted through an afternoon shift. Italian workers favored salami and hard cheese, choices selected specifically because cured meat and aged cheese survive heat far better than anything fresh, making them ideal for a worker with no access to cold storage during a 10-hour day. Eastern European immigrants leaned toward dense rye bread and pickled vegetables, another combination chosen for shelf stability rather than flavor preference alone. Polish and Slavic workers in the steel mills of Pittsburgh often carried kielbasa alongside cabbage, another cured meat, solving the identical refrigeration problem in an entirely different cultural wrapper. None of this was really about taste. Each of these foods solved the same underlying logistics problem: how to carry enough calories through a long shift without a kitchen, without ice, and often without a break long enough to eat comfortably. In New York specifically, oysters occupied a strange and telling position in the working-class diet, one that sounds almost absurd against their modern reputation as a luxury food. They were, at the time, remarkably cheap and abundant, harvested from local waters in massive quantities, before pollution and over-harvesting collapsed the supply later in the century. Oyster carts lined working-class neighborhoods precisely because the product required no cooking equipment beyond a knife and cost almost nothing compared to other proteins. And some accounts suggest working New Yorkers ate oysters as a regular protein source multiple times a week, not as a delicacy, but as the cheapest seafood available in a coastal industrial city. A worker could eat a dozen oysters, standing at a cart, for less than the price of a single cut of decent meat, and that arithmetic alone explains why the food showed up so often on tenement tables. Beyond what workers carried from home, saloons developed an economic innovation that deserves its own extended look, because it reveals something uncomfortable about how survival actually worked in these cities. Bars offered food at no direct charge, provided a customer purchased at least one drink. The food itself was often salty by design, crackers, cheese, cured meats, engineered to encourage further drink purchases. But for a factory worker stretching a thin wage, this functioned as a genuine caloric lifeline. One 5-cent beer bought access to a spread of food that might otherwise have been unaffordable. Saloons became an unofficial extension of the industrial food economy, quietly subsidizing the caloric shortfall that low wages created. And this system mattered most for single male workers without a household kitchen behind them. Men who had migrated alone to industrial cities and depended on this exact commercial loophole for a meaningful share of their daily calories. This detail deserves a moment of honest reflection, because it complicates the simple narrative of industrial villainy versus worker suffering. The free lunch was exploitative in its underlying commercial logic, designed to drive alcohol sales among an exhausted population. And yet it also functioned as one of the only reliable sources of protein many workers accessed regularly. Survival during this era rarely came from purely benevolent sources. It came from wherever the gaps in an indifferent system happened to align with a worker's immediate need. And the saloon-free lunch stands as one of the clearest examples of that uncomfortable overlap between exploitation and genuine sustenance. Now step inside an actual American tenement kitchen, because the daily rhythm of meals tells the story better than any single statistic. Breakfast, for most working families, meant bread, sometimes with a smear of lard or, later in the period, margarine once it became widely available and affordable. Coffee, often stretched with chicory or reused grounds to make a limited supply last longer, replaced tea as the standard hot drink in most American households, though the underlying logic was identical to what British families did with tea leaves: extend a small purchase across as many servings as possible. Children in these households often drank the same weak coffee adults did, partly out of habit and partly because clean water in rapidly industrializing cities was frequently unreliable, carrying the same risks that pushed British families toward tea instead of water. Lunch, eaten either at home before a shift or carried into the factory itself, rarely resembled a sit-down meal. Bread again, sometimes with whatever protein the household could afford that week, sometimes with nothing beyond the bread itself. Salt pork appeared constantly in American working-class diets, specifically because salting was a preservation method that required no refrigeration and no icebox, a piece of technology far outside the budget of most tenement households. A small piece of salt pork, boiled with beans or greens, could stretch across multiple meals and multiple days, making it one of the most economically efficient proteins available to a family managing an unpredictable industrial wage. Textile mills present a slightly different picture worth pausing on, because the workforce inside them was disproportionately young women, many recruited from rural farms into company boarding houses attached to the mills themselves. These boarding houses controlled meals directly, serving communal breakfasts and dinners on a fixed schedule dictated by the mill bell rather than individual appetite or preference. The food served in these settings tended toward the same repetitive base: bread, salted meat, boiled vegetables, weak coffee. But the portion sizes and quality varied enormously depending on how tightly a given mill owner controlled costs. Some boarding houses gained reputations for decent, filling meals as a recruitment advantage in a competitive labor market. Others became notorious for exactly the opposite: thin soups and stale bread, serving as a quiet form of wage suppression through food rather than pay. Meatpacking workers in Chicago faced their own particular irony, laboring inside facilities that produced enormous quantities of meat while frequently unable to afford anything beyond the cheapest cuts and offal for their own tables. Access to fresher, higher-quality meat existed literally around them, yet remained financially out of reach, illustrating a pattern that would repeat across industrial America. Proximity to abundance did not translate into access for the workers producing it. Dinner, back in the tenement setting, offered slightly more substance if the family was fortunate. A vegetable soup or stew, sometimes with a small amount of meat, contributing more flavor than actual protein content. More bread to fill remaining space in the stomach. Meat, when it appeared, was frequently the cheapest cuts available. Organ meats, trotters, whatever parts wealthier households declined to purchase. This was not romantic thrift passed down as tradition. It was the direct result of wages that left no margin for anything else, structured by employers who had little incentive to pay more when a constant stream of new immigrants kept arriving in cities desperate for any employment at all. The math was simple and brutal in its simplicity. As long as someone else was willing to take the job at the same wage, there was no market pressure pushing food quality upward. Company towns added another layer to this economic squeeze, particularly in mining and mill regions, where a single employer also owned the general store, supplying most household food. Workers paid partly in company-issued scrip, rather than standard currency, were effectively locked into purchasing food at prices the same employer controlled, with little ability to shop around for better value elsewhere. This arrangement, sometimes called the truck system, meant that even a nominally decent wage could translate into a genuinely poor diet once the employer had extracted its markup on every loaf of bread and pound of salt pork sold back to the worker who had earned the money in the first place. Food adulteration compounded every one of these problems, and America was no exception to the pattern seen across the industrialized world. Bread sold to working-class neighborhoods was frequently bulked out with cheap fillers to stretch a baker's flour supply and lower production costs, a practice documented extensively on both sides of the Atlantic. Milk delivered to tenement households was often watered down to increase volume, then given a false richness with chalk or similar additives to restore the appearance of full-fat milk. None of this was hidden from producers. It was an open industry practice, driven by the same profit logic that kept wages low and workdays long. And it meant that even when a family managed to scrape together enough money for what looked like a full meal, that meal could be quietly undermining the health it was supposed to sustain. Now, briefly, cross the Atlantic, because a parallel study from Paris in 1905 illustrates the same underlying mechanism with different local ingredients, and the contrast sharpens the American picture rather than distracting from it. A French blacksmith, studied by physicians Landouzy and Labbé, consumed roughly 4,600 calories daily, 900 of which came from wine, absinthe, and a nightcap of spirits before bed. His female counterpart, doing comparable physical labor in the same industry, received barely 1,400 calories, nearly 700 short of what her body needed. That gender gap was not explained by biology. It was economic. Women were paid less across every industrial sector, so women were fed less, and household budgets simply reflected what wages allowed rather than what bodies required. American factory towns showed the identical pattern in their own wage records, even where the specific foods on the table looked completely different from bread, wine, and absinthe. Return now to the consequences of all this, because the individual meals only matter in aggregate over months and years of repetition. Scurvy, historically associated with sailors on long voyages, reappeared among urban poor populations in American cities whose diets consisted overwhelmingly of bread, salt pork, and minimal fresh produce. Vitamin C simply was not present in sufficient quantities in a diet built around preserved meat and adulterated bread. Rickets, a bone deformation disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, became disturbingly common among industrial children who spent daylight hours inside factories rather than outdoors, compounding a diet already low in the nutrients that support skeletal development. Anemia followed a similar pattern, driven by iron-poor diets, heavy in bread, and light in the organ meats and greens that might otherwise have compensated. Alcohol consumption treated by contemporary reformers as a moral failing of the working class, functioned in practice as a predictable outcome of a diet where alcohol, through saloon beer as much as anything else, supplied a meaningful percentage of total daily calories for many workers. This was not a lifestyle choice so much as a caloric necessity built into an inadequate food system, one that temperance advocates of the era rarely understood in these terms, focusing instead on individual willpower rather than the structural hunger driving saloon attendance in the first place. The gendered caloric gap deserves one final return, because it did not resolve itself through better wages or better science within this period. It resolved itself, when it resolved at all, only when reformers and eventually legislation began forcing minimum wage standards and factory inspection regimes that acknowledged nutrition as a labor issue rather than a private household matter. Until that shift, women performing physically demanding factory labor continued receiving systematically less food than men performing comparable work, justified by medical opinion that mistook the symptoms of chronic underfeeding for evidence of natural female frailty. The same pattern repeated in child labor cases, where growing bodies received proportionally less food than the physical demands of factory work actually required, a mismatch that left lasting effects on an entire generation's adult health decades after the mills themselves had closed. There is something worth sitting with honestly here, something that goes beyond the statistics and the historical mechanics of bread adulteration and caloric distribution. The people living through this were not distant abstractions, enduring hardship for our modern benefit of comparison. They built the railroads, the steel, the textiles, the very foundations of American industrial power, largely on a diet that today would be flagged immediately by any basic nutritional standard. And they did so without knowing, in most cases, that the bread itself was working against them, that the saloon lunch was a hunger solution disguised as a drinking habit, that the caloric math was quietly stacked against half the workforce from the start. What sits uncomfortably at the center of all this is not simply that conditions were harsh. It is that the harshness was largely invisible to the people experiencing it, absorbed as normal, as simply how life worked. In the same way, a fish does not register water. The tenement father eating salt pork and bread every night was not making a desperate choice. He was following the only pattern he had ever known, inherited from whatever country or countryside he had left behind, in a system that offered no visible alternative and very little room to imagine one. So when you picture the modern factory floor, the modern grocery store, the modern lunch break with its refrigeration and its abundance and its casual disregard for what a meal actually costs to produce and preserve, it is worth asking what invisible arithmetic might be running underneath our own daily choices right now, unnoticed, in exactly the way the alum in that bread once was. If any of this connects with what you already knew about the era, or contradicts it entirely, that gap between assumption and historical record is usually where the most interesting conversations begin. Leave your thoughts below. Tell us which detail surprised you most, and if these forgotten details of daily survival matter to you, subscribe to the channel so the next chapter of this history finds its way to you.